This was actually a very well-tolerated drug and no additional toxicity with this combination essentially. They took it up to 5, 10, and 20 milligrams, and really there's no major side effects that limited them. Wait a second, this is too high of a dose. And when we look at the efficacy or how active this combination is, if we look at the right-hand column, just to give you an idea, these are patients without prior Revlimid. These are 22 patients, small number of patients. And the response rate was 95%, the OR, which is the third column, the third row. And just to give you a little bit of perspective, if you look at Revlimid and low-dose dexamethasone, the response rate that you would normally expect is around 60%. And that's when you use the high-dose dexamethasone, the 4 days on, 4 days off. And so this response rate of almost 95% of patients with a lower dose of dex is pretty impressive, even with these small numbers. If you look at all patients, the response rate is 82%. Again, this slide here again shows you some of those similar numbers. And really importantly, if you look at the most right-hand column, you'll see refractory to their most recent therapy. And when you start becoming refractory, that means that you're growing through whatever we're giving you. So it's not like you had a response and then 6 months later or a year later you relapse. These are patients who are refractory. That means they're growing through whatever active therapy you're getting. Those are always a tougher disease to treat. And even in that setting, and that's what the right-hand column is showing you, that 80% of these patients did respond if you look at the ORR in the third row. So suggesting this is actually a very active combination and very well tolerated, but also very active in these patients, both who were Revlimid naive or even who had prior Revlimid. Again, this is a summary slide showing you that lenalidomide naive patients, the response rate was anywhere between 94 to 100%. In patients who all comers, the response rate is around 80%, which is much higher than you'd normally expect with the addition of this one drug. And so now elotuzumab, based on this very early promising data, is moving quickly forward into 2 large trials, which should be available nationally and open sometime this year. And the first one is Revlimid plus dexamethasone in the relapse setting, plus or minus elotuzumab. You'll also be opening a very similar trial in the newly diagnosed patient as well. So Revlimid plus low-dose dexamethasone plus or minus elotuzumab. So those trials will be open shortly, sometime in the next several months. So we're currently finishing off writing those protocols, and so taking it out to all the sites around the country. So there's a number of other clinical trials that are also available. These are kind of the most promising ones we talked about. We talked about the proteasome inhibitors. We talked about the HDAC inhibitors, the pomalidomide, the elotuzumab. There's a number of other drugs as well that are out there, including, if you look at the websites, you'll see 20 to 30 different types of drugs that are being looked at. A couple of other promising ones I want to touch on real quick. There's this one drug at the top called KSP inhibitor. And this is really a novel class of drugs, something that we have not looked at previously in myeloma. And we're looking at it at MD Anderson plus about 4 other centers around the country. And so this is a drug that has single agent activity. So we're seeing response rates in these patients who've had multiple lines of prior therapy, and it's fairly well tolerated. And the reason that I'm excited about this is because the drugs that we've talked about have mostly been in the IMiDs, so Revlimid, thalidomide, pomalidomide class, or the Velcade, carfilzomib class. And everything else we have so far does not have single agent activity. That means they don't work by themselves, they work in conjunction with our pre-existing drugs. And this KSP inhibitor is a new drug that works by itself, independent of any other drug combination. So it's an important new class of drugs that we're looking at, which has some activity at this point in time. There's a number of other monoclonal antibodies that's also being in research currently. So I briefly mentioned the CS1 or the elotuzumab. There's a number of other monoclonal antibodies targeting CD74, CD138, CD56. And so these are, again, cell surface markers. So these markers that I mentioned, the 74, the 138, these are proteins that are seen on the surface of these myeloma cells that we will specifically target. So those are really the major areas of clinical trial that we see, both in new drug development as well as understanding why we have Velcade resistance or Revlimid resistance and trying to overcome that. That's much of the research that we're doing now. So. And I think there's a couple of kind of bullet points up here you can always look at, both for the IMF or the MMRC. You can look at MD Anderson website or clinical trials or cancer.gov. You can always email me directly as well. So we'll stop there.